let me show you a way of drawing nature, of capturing the feel of nature using a fine liner pen, drawing directly freehand in ink without any pencil. Now, ink line is not the most sympathetic medium to use to draw nature because nature is so effuse, so irregularly shaped, so interlocking, and creates so many values, often of extremely complex edging and texture. So how do we draw natural scenes? Now, I'm drawing this at the moment with a 0.2 millimeter pen. This silver barreled pen that you'll see at different times is 0.2. Just using that scrap of paper to check the proportions of my steps in case I need to adjust things later. At this stage, I'm mostly just trying to map out a few skeletal marks to capture the largest elements of this scene that aren't a tangle of detail. The steps, the main rocks, and some of the general direction. Now I've switched to a 0.3 millimeter pen, which I'm going to use just for this foliage on the left-hand side. And I'll use this pen for most of the time when I draw those couple of thin trees on the right-hand side. Otherwise, most of this will be drawn with the 0.2, except for a few details in the very far distance at the end where I'll use a 0.1. But quite frankly, because the 0.2 is getting pretty dry and the 0.1 isn't, I don't think really there was any difference between the two. In fact, the 0.1 may have been putting more ink on the page than the 0.2. Now at this point, there's simply a lot of hack work to do. You're watching this at 5 times the drawing speed. So if you want to see it slower, you can take it down to half speed, the video to half speed. And if 24 minutes is too long for the time you've got to watch this, you can speed it up, I suppose, to 10 times. And then it will only take 12 minutes. Now, at this point, I'm trying to explore and work out how I'm going to do these strappy plants that explode in all direction from a central core from ground level, which are very common in the Australian bush around where I live, on the east coast of Australia. And they can be very challenging. Now, these are a great example for the technique of trying to capture the effect of something rather than draw all the detail. In fact, that principle is really important for most of this scene. And hatching is going to be very important in doing that as well. But for now, I'm trying to get these steps, these wooden logs that define a few steps of a slight incline, because visually they're very important for the scene. Besides the path itself, the flat, somewhat cleared area of the path, these steps are the only thing that is not nature. The only thing that is man-made, has a sense of geometry about it. And so as a contrast, they're important, but also as a means of our being able to interpret quickly what we're looking at. And that's always a bit of a challenge in a tangled bush scene such as this. Now, I'm also trying to work out some of the values with this. I'm not really going to adjust all the values until the end, but I want to make these dark enough now so that I don't end up doing all the values too light and then have too much to do all at once at the end. So the thing about values, about darkness or lightness that we create with hatching is we can't work out easily how dark something looks until we see what values are around it. And when I'm hatching around the rocks, and really anything else at all, I'm also paying attention to the surface form of the object. Now, if it's a rock, it's curving around. If it's a massive tangle, then it's going to be a spiky effect that I want to, in some ways, suggest with my hatching. So I'm just working up this uppermost step now. I'm trying to draw this same size, putting the tape around this for the border is a helpful way of helping me keep the proportions, because I can reference off the edge of the photo and then reference off the edge of where the taped area is. Though in this instance, primarily my reason for doing it is having a nice straight edge, creating a sort of frame for my drawing. So you can see what I'm doing. It looks like I'm drawing quite a lot of detail at this stage, but in fact, all of these areas are going to be worked over before we get to the end, and a lot of adjustments made to what I've done already. So now I'm using the 0.3 and I'm doing these thin, it's actually one tree that branches near the base. When having a tree such as this, try and work out what you're looking at before you start to draw it. Work out, is it one tree? Is it two tree? Is this a branch coming off it, or is it part of a tree behind? One of those, the lower of those two branches going off, is actually part of a tree behind that I hadn't noticed until I was doing that bottom right corner at the very end at ground level and realized there was the end of the tree poking out from there. Now my hatching here for these trees I'm doing horizontally, and with those marks they're mostly not straight. There's a slight curve going one way or the other because I'm trying to also suggest the cylindrical form of the trees. And also I don't want to get a nice smooth straight edge because that doesn't really convey the effect of nature for this either. But I don't finish these trees obviously at this point. They're not finished. Again, I'm just trying to explore a bit and to create some sense of the value that I might be trying to get at the end to help me reference for the other hatching marks I'm doing. Now these rocks get pretty complex in lots of ways, and I need to be careful with my if you like outlines of the rocks where there is a form where a line is actually an accurate way of capturing visually what we're looking at, because in a lot of places they have these spiky strappy leaves going in front of them or other foliage, and if I leave a slight gap and have the foliage come through that gap, then it helps the brain understand that this is in front of that. This foliage is in front of those rocks. If I don't, it can become visually confusing. Try to create a sense of depths of plane moving back into a complex scene is very important, because as we move back into another plane further back from the one we've looked at, we're not having to look at everything all at once. We're separating parts out and seeing them in progression, and that helps our brain to read the marks and to understand what we're seeing. And again, I'm sort of in parts going back to outline, or marks to outline large shapes, so that I don't put marks in the wrong place. I don't do things that are going to literally pass through visually other things because I haven't separated the lines for one of them to allow the other to pass in front. Now we have this rock, very large overhanging rock, very common sandstone feature in the Australian bush, certainly on the eastern seaboard where we have a sandstone mountain range acting as some sort of east coast spine running down the whole continent of Australia from north to south. And so you can see my hatching to try and suggest some of the curvature. Now I am going to in some parts hatch in other directions, so it will be actually cross hatching in different parts. But for now, I'm trying to still plot the shapes that I want. When I talk about shapes, that means I have a focus on a flat two-dimensional area. If I'm talking of form, I'm focusing on the three-dimensional in the case of the rocks, curvature and moving in and out and cracked edges and weathered edges that a sandstone boulder in the bush weathering will have happen to it. And I find when I draw, it's helpful to be constantly flicking from shape to form, shape to form. When trying to plot the outline of an area that something takes up, shape is very helpful. But when we want to start to add the detail, and certainly if there's any hatching, then we need to make sure we understand the form that we're looking at. And in a subject such as this and these rocks, sometimes it's actually very helpful to slightly exaggerate the form that we have, how much things come out or bend or how sharp an edge is, because it can help us just read what we're looking at more easily. Now there's a lot of darkness in this central area between the rocks, and that's something that at the very end, after I actually take the tape off, I do the final adjustments, and I think those final adjustments make a big difference. So if you get sick of watching me draw this, zoom to the end to just before I take off the tape and get a sense of the overall effect, and then just see those final bits that happen at the end where I deepen some of the dark areas in several places. I feel it really helped us to be able to understand what we're looking at. It's also helpful with a scene such as this to be working over the whole area all the time. I think it's a big mistake to try and finish any one part because we really don't know what the final marks are best put on the paper as until we can see everything, because everything bounces off everything else. And particularly when we're trying to capture a focal point, as I am in most of the drawings I do, and certainly in this one where we've got this pathway, these steps, and then this pathway that winds up almost under this overhanging rock. We want to put marks and layer these marks and position them in such a way that a certain part is highlighted. And that's probably a good video, isn't it? How to control our marks to create a focus. Notice this tree that's just above to the left of where I was just drawing, that tree where I've actually drawn it just by hatching the horizontal lines, and notice the gaps I've left. Now they're to suggest the leaves. If you look at the reference, there are lots of leaves in front of that, and I either ignore them or I try and capture them in some way. And I've decided to try and capture that feeling, because that visually, I was going to say speckled feel, but the feel we get when you don't see anything particularly clearly, or so many things we can see behind other things, and so we get disrupted visual glimpses of shapes such as tree trunks and branches. So I find that's a helpful way, and just wait and see how that looks at the end. Now this section I'm kind of playing around with now. This is, in my mind, the most challenging part, where we have several of these strappy plants that come out from a base on the ground, layered back behind each other, catching the light, casting shadows. I really want the darker areas, the darker values that we have, to be dark, but I don't want to lose the sense of what these plants are, because they are very characteristic of the Australian bush, as much as they are very challenging to draw with any sense of realism. And I'm having to look through into that corner of the rocks in the upper left section as well, carefully when I'm doing that. And again, trying to perceive the values. Although it's generally dark, there are darker areas. And again, that's one of the areas I work on at the very end of this, to just sharpen a stronger three-dimensionality, I think. So now I decided that if I'm going to work on the right-hand side of the path, I better get a little more line work happening with these trees, because they are dark, the values are dark, and so I need to have some idea of how dark they're going to be so I know how dark to hatch the foliage that's around them. If we were to desaturate this image, if we were to take the colour out of the photo, there's a lot of similar values between the trunks and the backgrounds and the things around their base, and we don't want to capture that precisely because that will make it hard without the advantage of colour to understand what's happening, what we're looking at. So we always need to be prepared to make adjustments to the actual values we have in our reference to make our drawing work better. In the end, no one's going to be comparing it to the reference photo unless perhaps you've made a YouTube video and posted it online. But generally, people see our drawing only, and therefore it's our drawing that needs to work, or that we should be doing our best to make work. I often think and often speak of the photo as being a springboard for our drawing. It's our starting point, but we can make any adjustments at all if we think they're going to improve our drawing. Now, see these marks on the ground I'm starting to make across the foreground? Again, this is an area which often is I think, a struggle for people to draw, certainly from some of the photos, some of the drawings I see. And one of the things to bear in mind is take advantage of these marks to indicate the form of the ground. It's not dead flat, particularly when it gets to the sides, it slopes up in certain ways. And again, depending on what sort of leaf litter is there and how it's piled up and built up, the leaf litter also can have its own sort of undulating lines that it forms, where it catches perhaps in slight hollows or where the water runoff takes it before it drops to the ground. And so I want to get that rhythmic movement in the leaf litter as well. So it's not random just putting in lines, and that's the sort of detail that it's very easy to look at the reference and think, oh yes, I know what that is, and just start to do a mishmash of hatching back and forth and lose the opportunity to highlight the form that we have, which all adds to the sense of reality. All these small things that we do in different parts with different subjects in different light all count towards a greater effect of realism in our drawing. And equally, if we take shortcuts with them time after time after time, then they all build up to make our drawing look a tangle or awkward or just not quite right, or even cartoon-like when we're not trying to draw cartoons. So better that if we don't have the energy or the time to do the sort of work that the subject calls for, then we're better off keeping this subject for another time. This is actually a scene that I printed this reference off a couple of months ago, and every time I looked at it to draw, I thought, oh, I just don't have it in me, or I don't have the time. But it's been a week where I've done some drawings that I've been putting off, the other two because they look too hard. And so it's nice to actually clear the backlog, get them off my back. So now I'm doing this lower left and lower right, as I said, probably some of the most difficult areas. And I'm really trying to pay as much attention to value as well as to form, and then controlling the hatching to emphasize both, but also trying to put marks that do capture the actual object. So we've got twigs which are obviously straight or straightish. We've got gum leaves that have a bit of a shallow crescent shape. And we've got little just bits of dirt and chunks of rock and this and that. And so I'm trying to do a range of marks that without being precise, because we don't really notice individual things like this forest floor leaf litter and other detritus that we have there, but we do have a sense of it, and so I want to capture the sense of it with the marks I put. How's it going? I think I must have been changing my pen. Yes, I switched to the 0.1 millimeter pen. So now I'm doing these furthest things in the background, this foliage in the background. And I don't want it to be the same value as the closer foliage because I want it to stand back. Now that large gum, that may not even be obvious what it is in the photo. A large gum tree that's further back, but visually it joins up with the closer one in the front. It has a whole massive leaf in front, not so much to obscure it, but enough to create some sort of visual distortion. So I want to have that same visual distortion of the tree trunk myself, because that will help capture a sense of realism. So I didn't do a straight line down, because I don't want a hard edge, because the edge is interrupted by the leaves that are in front of the tree. And when I do a bit of hatching down the tree, I also try to disrupt the hatching to allow for that same visual disruption that we get in looking at it. Now I'm working on the values of the steps, so I'm feeling like I'm getting towards the end, and I'm trying to work out now what bits need to go darker. I'll make them darker first, because we can only go so dark. Once we've basically blacked in a solid space of ink, we can't go any darker. So I have to make sure that the areas that I want to be the darkest are that dark, and then I know I can't take any other area that dark as well. So that's why we have to leave our adjustments till the very end, and we don't get too caught up in hatching in too small an area early on. And this rock on the right side of the steps is one that I make a few adjustments to, I think, after I take the tape off. Now I'm just enhancing that silhouette of that rock because I felt it was getting lost in the background. There's one of the problems with watching this so sped up is you don't get a sense of how much I'm looking at the reference all the time. It looks like I'm okay and draw. But in fact, I'm really paying a lot of attention now to the reference. But I'm also standing up quite a bit and both looking at the drawing from just standing up at the desk, but also looking at it through the camera, which gives me a different appreciation of the values. To be asking myself, can we read it when we look at it? Is it clear? Is there too much mid-value in some parts? Because this is a scene with a lot of mid-value. Now, I can't add lighter values to anything because I can't add white paper where I've got lines. So my tool at this stage is to darken the areas that are perhaps a bit too mid. And now I just add those details there and I'm done. Look, please hit the like button if you found this interesting. Of course, the photo is on my channel community page if you'd like to have a go yourself. Not an easy subject, but you could just try and do a part of it, particularly maybe some of the parts where there are some rocks or just the steps, and start to explore how you might find the best marks to capture the feel of this bushland scene. Or take one of the bush that's around you with the sorts of plants that you're more familiar with. But hey, in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.